So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this month's AGU AGI Heads and Chairs webinar. So a couple introductions real quickly. Pranoti Asher, Assistant Director of Grants and Education Programs at AGU is on here with us. I'm Christopher Keene, Director of Geoscience Professional Higher Ed at AGI, along with Leila Gonzalez and Delaney Robinson, who are also helping with today's webinar, and both are from AGI. So today's webinar, with no further ado, is an update on the Geoscience COVID-19 Impact Study, examining impacts and resilience within academia. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Leila Gonzalez, technical specialist and the person really the force behind driving this COVID-19 study, and she has a absolute ton to share with everybody. All yours, Leila.
Thanks, Chris. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. And I just want to give us an update on the study that Chris and I have been working on for the past few years here, with a real focus on looking at impacts to academia, both faculty, departments, and students, and with some look at the workforce too, and how recent graduates have been doing throughout the course of the pandemic. So with that, we'll jump right in. So before we get into the actual results, I do want to take a moment to review the goals and the design of the project. We started this project back in May of 2020 with the goals to assess both the short-term and the long-term changes the pandemic would have on geoscience academic programs, on students, and on the workforce as a whole. And through our survey efforts, what we aimed to do was to establish a pre-pandemic and post-pandemic baseline of both workplace and instructional environments to understand both the magnitude and the permanency of the changes brought about by the pandemic. And so really taking a step back, when we look at the broader goals of the project, it's really to inform response and recovery planning for future disruptive events such as disasters as well as future pandemics, by providing a wealth of information on the trajectory of how the geosciences have responded specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic. So here's a brief look at the survey design. So when a study participant opts into the study, what they do is they join one of the many survey cohorts that you can see here listed on the left. Those in organizational cohorts either represent geoscience academic departments or geoscience employers, and those study participants who join as individuals either track into academic faculty, K-12 faculty that are teaching earth science, geoscience students, postdocs, geoscientists working in non-academic positions, unemployed geoscientists, or retired geoscientists. So all study participants then received a benchmark survey so that we could assess their situation as of February 2020, which was before the pandemic really took root here in the US. And then after completing that survey, then they track into the ongoing set of surveys and receive the next update survey request. So here we've got a slide that shows all the different types of data we collect in this study with each type of survey. So the gray circles here with the I in them, those represent the individual cohort surveys. The blue circles with the A are the surveys that and the data points that we're collecting for academic departments. And then the red circles with the E represent the employer surveys. So as you can see here, there's quite a few areas where we do have surveys that are all tracking the same types of data. And so where we can, we ask either the same or very similar questions on those individual academic department and employer surveys so that we get a good perspective both from the individual as well as the organizational. And that gives us a good spectrum to look at those types of data topics that we're collecting. So the study, as you can imagine, is a very big study. It's a multi-cohort longitudinal study, and we've been collecting data for every 2 weeks for almost 3 years now. We allowed study participants to onboard throughout the end of last year, and survey participants are sent invitations via email to participate every 2 weeks. So we've got a set of survey questions that are in every single survey, and then one survey each month asks some additional questions for some more in-depth feedback. Now, participants are not required to answer every survey, and in fact, what we've seen over the course of the past few years is that participants tend to respond when there are either upticks in pandemic activity, or if there are major changes in their lives, such as a job change or a major change at their organization. And so, although we do have plenty of participants who do answer every single survey, as depicted in the top graphic on the right, We also have quite a few survey participants that answer more like the bottom right graphic. So they're answering periodically throughout the whole course of the study. And so the main point of sending surveys twice a month really is to establish a monthly baseline of information for each cohort. So to date, we've got 100 academic departments participating in the study, of which 86 are considered active. And what that means is that they've completed surveys in at least 2 different months. We also have 122 geoscience employers participating, of which 98 are active, and over 1,600 individuals participating, of which close to 1,400 have been active in the study. So now that we've got a good look at the survey design, let's dive into the results. We're going to take a look at pandemic impacts on departments and instructional formats and see how that's changed. Take a look at impacts to skills and knowledge acquisition by students and new graduates, and impacts to workplace environments as well, especially as that relates to recent graduates. And take a look at what changes have persisted to date. So as far as academic departments are concerned, budgets are improving. Cuts in the 2020-2021 academic year were less severe than expected, which is good. And this year, less than a third of departments are expecting any budget cuts for next academic year. And meanwhile, about 60% are expecting no change to their budget for the coming year. In terms of staffing impacts, most of those impacts occurred during the summer of 2020, which was mostly focused on reduction in hours and furloughs of staff and non-tenured faculty. We see active hiring picking up in mid-2021, and really that's remained relatively steady since then, with about 20% of departments hiring staff and faculty. However, we do see hiring freezes and positions being left unfilled, so that's the purple line there in the chart, that's persisting for about 10% of departments. So when we look at travel and field activity, what we're seeing is that as vaccine availability increased, we see a decrease in regulatory prohibitions on faculty travel and field work. And by the middle of last year, most departments reported faculty on travel or working in the field, either without restrictions or in limited locations. Now, if you look to the right on the graphic, the surge we see in late 2021 in faculty choosing not to travel or do field work, and that's the bright blue peak there, that occurs during the spread of the Delta variant. And we still see that as the primary reason for not traveling or doing field work in January during the Omicron surge. Now, we are finishing cleaning up the February and March data, so we should have the new results coming out on that soon. So stay tuned for our Geoscience Currents updates on that. So what we've seen also with departments is departments responding to the pandemic through changes to promotion and tenure guidelines. Now, the primary change that most departments reported was making extensions to the promotion clock, and most departments were requiring that faculty needed to opt in to take advantage of that accommodation. Other changes that were implemented were exclusion of student and teaching evaluations and submission of pandemic impact statements. Now, what was really interesting is when we asked faculty if they took advantage of the accommodations to the promotion and tenure guidelines, 80% of the faculty in our study reported not opting to take advantage of those pandemic-related changes. So another thing we also look at is institutional plans for the next academic term. And while those plans were increasingly hopeful for a return to normal during last summer, the spread of the Delta variant and then later the Omicron surge diminished those hopes substantially. So as of January, the expectations for the next term were in-person instruction with restrictions, namely related to masking, testing, and vaccines. And although vaccines are not universally mandated, the restrictions such as frequent testing are often required for those who are not vaccinated. And in addition, we also see institutions continuing to plan for hybrid course options there in the blue line on the left graphic. So one of the bright notes was that continuing students continue to persist in their academic studies, so most planning to return full-time the next term. So there was not attrition in that respect. In addition to the graduating cohort in 2021, we do see some small cohorts of students in the light blue line on the bottom there who have delayed graduation to return part-time to finish their studies. And this occurred in fall of 2020 as well as in fall of 2021. Now, since 2020, we have seen a big switch in instructional formats for courses, going primarily from online only to in-person with pandemic-related restrictions. And most departments offering at this point in January, as our latest data point, most departments offering only in-person instruction. That inflection point really happened during fall of 2021, prior to the spread of the Delta variant. And then what we see with the Omicron surge in January, we see a decline in in-person instruction and then an uptick in online-only courses. We also have the percentage of departments reporting courses being instructed in person without restriction. That's remained near 20% since August of last year. And that's the black line at the bottom of the chart there. So similar to courses, when we look at labs, half of departments are now offering only in-person labs. And we've got about 1/5 of departments offering dual instructional formats, usually a combination of in-person and online. And then in terms of field instruction, that has finally returned to in-person instruction, but primarily at local sites. What we see is 3/4 of departments are offering only in-person field instruction. And we also see some persisting restrictions related to the pandemic on vehicle usage and travel, which is likely limiting the geographic range of field activities. So one of the things that we've kind of been tracking over time is looking at the integration of virtual instruction into the curriculum. So we asked departments and faculty about their long-term plans for integrating virtual labs and field activities into the curriculum. And we asked that in 2020 and 2021. And what was interesting is that whereas department heads indicated plans for integrating virtual labs and field activities as supplemental materials and backup sections for cases where faculty or students couldn't attend, or as preparatory or follow-on activities to in-person activities, faculty were more inclined to integrate virtual instruction as either supplemental or as backups. And then the other note is faculty were more inclined to not integrate virtual lab and field activities than were department chairs. So as we go forward with time and we see kind of some of the changes in instructional formats, we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of months when we get that data cleaned. Now, we also asked faculty and students about their interest in teaching and learning in a virtual format. And both students and faculty were least interested in fully virtual field and lab activities. And students were more interested in virtual learning than faculty were in virtual teaching, especially for hybrid instruction. But when we look at the chart here, we see that both faculty and students were most interested in fully online lecture courses. So that was the closest there. So that was interesting to see. Now, workloads for virtual instruction relative to in-person instruction have lessened as faculty have become more adept at using platforms and designing and delivering courses in a virtual format. But that said, the workload for virtual instruction is still higher than that for in-person instruction, especially for course prep as well as delivery. So although things are getting better, it's still a lot more work. Another thing we've looked at in relation to virtual instruction has been satisfaction with teaching as well as learning. And since December of 2020, we've seen increasing satisfaction among faculty with many aspects of virtual instruction, especially with the quality of online content, with engagement of students, group work among students, and quality of the online course platforms. We do see a pretty steady response over time with satisfaction with online assessments. And then if you look to the right here on the graphic, we do see a little drop there in moderate to extremely satisfied faculty in January in terms of quality of online course platforms. And one thing that we this might be reflecting is faculty more fully using the platforms to their maximum capacity. So we'll keep an eye on that as we clean our data for the next 2 months out. We see a lot more variability in student satisfaction with online learning. And some of this might be reflective of student fatigue with having to continue with online learning, as well as with the continued switches from in-person instruction to online instruction, especially during the Omicron surge in January. And that said, though, we do see an increase in student satisfaction for group work, engagement with instructors, and quality of online course content. So we also asked about the benefits and the drawbacks of virtual instruction, and the feedback there was that the largest benefits to virtual instruction was the flexibility it provides to students for taking courses when they were unable to attend in person. And another high point there was the ability for students to go back and review content as many times as they needed and at their own pace, especially for courses that were, or sections that were covering really complex content. So students had that ability to re-review so that they could fully comprehend and learn the content that they needed to do for class. But challenges with virtual instruction still persist. Student engagement and quality of course instruction remain the top challenges across the board. Although as time has progressed, there has been a lessening in challenges with student engagement, as we've seen on the previous slides. Quality of education continues to remain a concern, and this likely reflects the time crunch on faculty, as well as the substantial prep time required for virtual courses. So one of the other things that we looked at in the surveys were cancellation of instructional activities. So in 2020, 2021, field courses and field components of courses were the most impacted by the pandemic. But in the 2021-2022 academic year, we do see an uptick in cancellation of lecture courses and lab sections. But this is primarily due to low enrollments and not directly related to pandemic impacts in terms of canceling courses. Now, we asked also students about impacts to their degree progress, and the top impact we see reported by students was delays in tasks related to their theses, their dissertations, and senior capstone projects, and also impacts to field instruction during the 2021 field season, as seen here in the green dashed line, which corresponds to the increase in delays of graduations and defenses. And then at the end of 2021, we see an increase in the percentage of students reporting changes to their project designs, presumably so that they could finish and graduate at the end of this current academic year. Now, nearly half of departments have reported that their continuing students were not able to take required courses during the 2020-2021 academic year, and just over 40% of departments reported the same for graduating students. Continuing students were more likely to have not been able to take field components to courses, and graduating students were more likely to not have been able to take field courses. So the topics that students were unable to learn through those courses included field methods, mineralogy, sedimentology, and structural geology. Those were the top cited topics in those courses that students were unable to take. So we asked departments about what actions they were taking in order to assist students in their degree completion progress. We looked at both continuing students and graduating students, and what departments, the feedback from them was for continuing students, departments reported accepting substitutions for required courses, either alternate courses or independent study research projects. Departments would also issue waivers for prerequisites, accepting makeup courses or directed studies in lieu of the prerequisites. And we see some departments reserving spaces in their 2021-2022 field courses so that they could offer those spaces to students who were unable to take the field courses in the previous year. And then departments also were allowing students to postpone their degree progress, and that corresponds to the delays that we're seeing in graduations and defenses and some of the other data. Now, for graduating students, departments reported waiving field course requirements or allowing students to delay graduation so that they could take an in-person field course when that became available. And departments reported also accepting substitutions for missed field courses, accepting either makeup courses or independent studies to fulfill the field course requirement. Now, another thing that we looked at was graduating students, asking them about how they handled their course requirements for their degree completion. And over half of graduating students reported that they were able to complete required lecture courses, labs, and field experiences. However, as we see here in the green bars, field courses and field components to courses were the more likely to have substitutions accepted or be waived by departments. Now, we also asked graduating students about the skills and or knowledge that they wish they would have obtained prior to graduating. And what's interesting to see here in the chart on the right is that field skills and lab skills were not selected by any graduating students when we asked this question, but rather what was most important that they wish they would have obtained were skills related to programming, database management, data visualization, and mapping software. Those were the most commonly cited skills and knowledge that they wish they would have learned before graduating. So when we asked about how they were acquiring these skills, the graduates were reporting they were either using self-taught instruction or learning on the job. So next we're going to take a look at changes in departmental operations as it relates to work environments. So it's a little bit of a shift here. And while what we see here in the data is that in-office workplace policies continue to be the norm for most departments, we have seen an uptick in remote first policies where faculty and staff are able to choose their location on any given day, whether it be remote or in the office. And we also see a shift during the Delta variant surge to increased percentages of departments offering remote work to faculty and staff. And that's the blue line on the bottom. You see that increase there. Now, what's interesting but not surprising is that the shift in work policies. So basically, we see a shift in work policies to that of a focus on limited remote work from a more flexible situation in April of 2021. We definitely see here in these two charts with looking at in-office work policies on the left and remote work policies on the right. We definitely see an overlap here of academic term requirements to support in-person teaching, as well as a responsiveness to the pandemic situation. So during the start of fall 2021, we see a shift towards more permanent in-office work policies that then shift to more fluid options as we get into December and January. And we also see an uptick in departments offering flexible remote work policies starting in November. So when we look at how faculty are spending their time in different locations, specifically at the office in the chart on the left and at remote work locations in the chart on the right, we do see some responsiveness to the pandemic situation as well. So as fall 2021 began, we see an uptick in faculty spending more than half time on campus, but this then drops by January during the Omicron surge as time working at home picks up slightly. However, that said, at least half of faculty reported working more than half time in the office as of January. And when we looked at how departments were assisting faculty and staff in remote work, we're seeing that most are providing equipment and training. And with the shift to online course delivery platforms, most of that training was on new applications related to those online course platforms. We also asked faculty and students about their work at home and learning from home setup, because that's very important in order to facilitate both being able to teach remotely as well as being able to learn and study remotely. And what we see here is that over time, students have adjusted their home environments to be more conducive to remote learning, namely shifting away from shared workspaces, which tend to have more distractions in them, upgrading internet connectivity, and obtaining additional supplies needed for learning. However, what we do see is that faculty are more likely to report using dedicated workspaces than students, and also having new hardware than students. Faculty have also reported an increase in productivity across all categories here in this chart, looking at remote work activities, except for teaching. And so one of the things that this may signal is that faculty may be beginning to fully use their online course platforms and are starting to really push the boundaries of those applications. And another thing that also could be at play here is an issue of workloads and priorities, time availability. So as increased productivity happens in other areas such as research, teaching also may be impacted as a result. For students, though, there's been a general decrease in productivity across all of these categories. And this is likely due to two cohorts of students in the data. One that was graduating in 2020, 2021, where pandemic-related impacts would have been near the end of those student studies. And then we've got continuing students, that cohort, and the impacts to that cohort would be felt during the development of their research projects. So what we may be seeing here is that could account for what we're seeing in terms of the ability to focus and the declines in productivity related to research activities. So another thing that we looked at was concerns, both related to the pandemic and as well as not related to the pandemic for departments, faculty, and students. And for departments, student recruitment and retention continues to be the top concern related to the pandemic, and also is an increasing concern not related to the pandemic. Budgets and staffing are also an increasing concern not related to the pandemic, and much of this ties back into the declining enrollments across higher education as a whole. Now for faculty, workplace safety continues to be the top concern driven by the pandemic, followed by the quality of instruction. And job security was reported by faculty as the top concern not related to the pandemic. Now for students, the concern related to the pandemic and not related to the pandemic is employment opportunities, as well as safety in the work environment for related to the pandemic. So we also take a look at how pandemic-related restrictions have changed over time, and we do see an overall lessening in those restrictions, but we also see some persistence for some activities. In terms of facility restrictions, limitations on staffing density and access still persist for some students and faculty. And in terms of health and safety restrictions, we're seeing the most common restrictions related to masking, vaccination status, and social distancing. And again, this data only goes through 2022 or in January of this year. And so it's before we're starting to see those mask mandates being rolled back across the US. So I think as we get into the February and March data, we'll see some changes here in this chart. And in terms of meeting and travel, while those restrictions have lessened overall, restrictions on in-person meetings and limitations to travel still persist. And there are some restrictions related to vehicle usage also persisting. And this, we think, probably ties back to some of the field activity limitations in terms of more field activities occurring more locally rather than remote. So questions that are still yet to be really fully answered. We've got quite a few here, but one being about instructional modes. Which ones are going to be integrated for the long term? How widespread will be the adoption of virtual instruction and in which formats and types of courses? And what factors will lead to that adoption? Will departments provide direction for integrating virtual instructional activities, or will the move be led by faculty? Will virtual instruction activities be used as recruiting tools? These are some interesting questions, and we hope that we can find out more as the data becomes available. Another thing we want to look at is how will pandemic-related accommodations to promotion and tenure guidelines impact career trajectories for faculty? And we had 80% of faculty in our study saying that they're not opting in to take advantage of those changes to promotion and tenure guidelines, but 20% are. And another thing to look at, will degree requirements change for majors? Will there be new skills incorporated into the curriculum to address employer needs, which we'll be looking at here shortly? Will there be more flexibility in completion requirements? So next we're going to turn to recent graduates as well as employers. And for recent graduates, what we see is over half have remained either employed or gained employment during the study period so far. For those who graduated during the pandemic, so in 2020 or 2021, they have had the highest percentage of being employed for all recent graduate cohorts. So what we did next is we grouped the two cohorts. So we've got the 2014 to 2018 graduates on the left chart, and then the 2019 to 2021 graduates on the right chart. And we can see relatively steady employment for the 2014 to 2018 graduates, although there is some decline in employment as some in that cohort went back to school in 2020 and 2021. For the chart on the right, looking at the 2019 to 2021 graduates, we see increasing employment for those individuals in that cohort, but that plateaued out in 2021 as unemployment persisted for just over about 10% of graduates. So we also looked at the types of occupations that recent graduates have, and we can see that those in the 2014 to 2018 cohort are primarily working in geoscience occupations, as indicated in the blue bars, whereas those in the 2019 to 2021 cohort have a higher percentage of working in non-geoscience occupations, as indicated in the orange bars there. And some of that may be reflective of accepting employment while still searching for jobs in the geosciences. So when we look at unemployment for recent geoscience graduates, we see that most unemployed recent geoscience graduates are actively seeking employment within the geosciences, and about a third are seeking work both inside and outside the profession. Now, when we asked graduates about their reasons for seeking work outside of the geosciences, the top reasons included a lack of job options within the profession and not having the skills or training needed for the positions being applied to. And that has held pretty steady throughout the entire study so far. So next thing we wanted to take a look at was changes in the workforce and look at the pandemic related impacts in terms of total employment. So what we see here is a steady decline in total employment in the chart on the left, starting in August of 2019, going through February of 2021. And we have two overlapping factors really driving this decline. One being the contraction in the oil and gas sector, and secondarily, the impacts from the pandemic. Now, looking at the year-over-year changes in employment here on the right, we see the strong signal from pandemic shocks on total employment there in red. However, we do see a good recovery in employment since mid-2021. So that's been good to see. So while impacts to business operations are lessening overall, employers are reporting continued supply chain disruptions, and that's about a third of employers are still dealing with those issues. Supply shortages, which we're not showing in this chart, but we are tracking, are also impacting employers. Now in 2020, it was lack of personal protective equipment, and last year it was IT supply shortages. And in terms of productivity, what we've seen is that over half of employers have reported workloads that are either equal to or in excess of staffing capacity. And then by the end of last year, just over half of employers were reporting that they had higher workloads than staffing capacity. So in terms of staffing expectations, at the rate at which companies expected to increase permanent staffing definitely grew during the first half of last year. We see companies becoming more cautious from August through October of last year over concerns of the impacts from the Delta variant. But then we see growth expectations returning starting in November and December. But that was prior to the widespread concerns about Omicron. So again, as we get the newer data in, we'll be able to see the changes here as we go forward. The percentage of employers with active job openings ranged between about 30% and 40% from late 2020 through 2021. We do see a sharp increase in openings between October and December of last year. Hiring lags job openings by a few months, but we see some peaks in hiring in June of last year. And even though we do see a contraction in hiring in October, we do see that increase again at the end of last year. And then employers were reporting by the end of 2021, we see over half of employers reporting having job openings, and we see about half of employers reporting making hires. Now, employers are hiring primarily full-time geoscientists, and then also hiring geoscience interns, but those are more likely to be hired in the late spring through the summer months. So employers have been dealing with challenges to finding and hiring talent, and recruitment continues to be a widely cited ongoing challenge as well as onboarding new staff, especially into remote working environments. As we move into the end of last year, we do see over half of employers starting to report no challenges to finding and hiring talent. So that's been a good change to see. Now, for employers, despite the return to in-office work policies in 2020 with the reopening of businesses, we see that remote work has remained an option for most workplaces. By the end of last year, we see over 80% of employers offering remote first work policies to their employees. That way, they allow their employees to choose their work location on any given day. We also see here in yellow a lower percentage of employers offering lab access, but that is more reflective of the number of companies with lab facilities than actual access to labs. So just something to keep in mind on that data point there. Now, employers, similar to academic departments, are supporting their remote workers by providing equipment, software, office supplies, furniture, and training, mostly on remote working technologies. And training was provided by about just over a third of companies. And one of the things noted by over half of employers is they've noted that because of the shift to a more distributed remote workplace and working environments, their active office space usage definitely declined. And so when we look at proficiency with virtual skills for employers and their employees, we see increased proficiency across all virtual skill categories listed here in the chart, with the most improvement in project collaboration. And this will tie back to some of the things that employers are looking for in their new hires, and we'll get to that in a moment. Employers have noted a wide range of benefits for the shift to remote work, including improved use of virtual platforms, improved communication, and definitely several benefits to employees, including reduced commute times, flexibility in work location and hours, and reduced work-related expenses. But the biggest challenge across the board is the lack of in-person interactions. That has been cited throughout the entire study as being an issue with remote work, and employers have been consistently saying that lack of in-person interaction means a lack of fostering work relationships, generating new ideas from informal discussions, and building company morale and community. So we also looked at employer hiring. Now, in terms of hiring, employers have noted that they do primarily hire bachelor's and master's graduates, but we also see just over half of employers indicating that they're also hiring doctorates. And in terms of skill sets that employers are looking for in new hires, we see that the top required skills are field skills, followed with proficiency for virtual platforms, with the latter becoming increasingly important. In addition, about 20% of employers have indicated that they're now looking for candidates who can work with minimal to no supervision. So some questions that we're still looking at, especially as it relates to the workforce, is are we going to see remote work and remote first policies become the norm? If so, will that shift enable a more geographically distributed workforce? And what is going to be the implications of that on employers if this does occur? And will employers continue financial and logistical support for those working remotely? Will we see employers reduce their operational footprint as a result of more of their workforce being remote? And if so, what will the impacts be to those employers that have lab facilities or advanced computing capabilities? Another big question is how will preferred and required skills for new hires change from what it was before the pandemic? How will employers address those skills and knowledge gaps for new hires that were students during the pandemic? So a lot to still look at. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I know it was a lot of data that we went through, so if you've got questions, I'd like to open the floor for that. And I've left my email here too, so if you have any questions after today, you can always reach out and contact me.
Thank you very much, Leila.
Thanks, Chris.
So if folks have any questions, feel free to either enter it in the chat, raise your hand.
And I'd like to ask questions and just see how everyone was, what were the challenges or some of the major things that you've been able to overcome during the pandemic from departments? That would be interesting to hear about as well.
So while we're waiting for folks to see if they have any questions, in your observation as we've gone through each of these waves and you've seen the responses by the departments, do you have a sense that with each wave the I'll say the abruptness or the severity of the response by the departments is staying the same, or is it proportional to the impact of the wave, or are we finding better ways to get through these?
I think one of the things we see is that it doesn't seem as abrupt, even though you have a switch back to online or back to in-person. I think that's becoming easier. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Especially in some of the more anecdotal data that we're getting in, it seems like, with the first shutdowns and the first having to shift over to fully virtual instruction, that was really hard. And we saw a lot of that in the comments coming through, a lot of the freeform responses. But I think over time, as faculty, especially as faculty, we're getting more adept at using the virtual platforms, having to shift back to in-person or online, shifting between those two modes became a little bit easier. We didn't see as much shock in the response, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
for definitely the building some resilience. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's good. So within the employers, were you able to? Do you have enough definition there to be able to tease out differences like nonprofits versus for-profit, or within those responses?
We probably can. I haven't done that to date. We've just been looking at bulk kind of distribution, but we probably could take a look at that. So that's a good question for sure. Okay.
And yeah, this is another interesting question. This came in. Do you see any differences between trends that are at minority serving institutions versus predominantly white institutions?
I would have to look and see if we have enough data to split those two out.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely some good questions and some good ideas for future currents. Absolutely.
So the other question is in those narrative responses that you're getting, mm-hmm. has there been any specific things that you have found particularly shocking, or unexpected?
Not really. One of the things that I've found that has been really neat to see is some faculty finding new resources and new ways and also department heads reporting back, new ways to integrate some of the virtual and leverage some of the online platform capabilities. So we've got some departments that are saying, hey, we can now have speakers from across the world, where we couldn't have done that before. So they are starting to integrate into their courses and maybe into the departmental colloquium, speakers from different institutions around the world. Some are reporting increased collaboration because of being able to not have to be physically present. So that's been beneficial. Some faculty saying that they're able to teach in different ways, being able to use 3D. Some of the other online resources that they've been able to find and use in their curriculum. So that's been really neat to see that positive response, because teaching online, obviously from the data and from the feedback, it's hard, but being able to find those bright spots there, I think, has been really neat to see.
Mm-hmm. So another one came in, where are the recent doctorates getting hired, just in academia or other sectors, similar to, where are the masters getting hired?
Yeah, I'll need to pull that data. I don't have that off the top of my head, but that's a good question, Pranoti. Chris, you've got some of that in the exit survey. I think you showed some of that data coming in on construction.
Yeah, the exit survey showed that the doctorates were sort of still being hired in academia at about the normal rate, but we saw a big increase in going into professional scientific services, and similarly with masters, the state government and groups like that were big hirers. So there's some shifting on the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense, in some of your responses from folks that have graduated, if they didn't? Was there a sense, sort of like we asked in the exit survey, did you get where you wanted to go, kind of question? Any sense from recent graduates if they felt that the pandemic really changed the direction that they were pursuing their employment?
Yeah, it's something we haven't really asked on that kind of introspective. We've been more data point oriented as to where are you employed currently, if they're in a postdoc, where that's at. But we haven't asked, is where you are where you wanted to be? That's a good question.
Okay.
I have a question just pretty much similar to Chris's, so it might be a little redundant, but I'm just kind of curious for myself if you, of the results that you showed today, if you found anything to be, surprising or something that you found interesting that needs maybe another look at, or anything specifically that you found of interest.
I think one of the interesting things, especially with the recent graduates, was taking a look at their occupations where they were working, especially the more recent graduates, and kind of seeing that difference between those that had graduated between 2014 and 2018, working primarily within the geoscience occupations, and then those more recent graduates, not as many were. So I would like to definitely dig into that data a little bit more and take a look at the next few months of data to see, are those recent graduates shifting out of kind of the non-geoscience occupations into geoscience occupations over time? Even though they're getting employed, they're not necessarily getting employed in perhaps the occupations that they're looking for, and that might just be a stepping stone. So that was really interesting to see, and something I definitely want to dig into the data a little bit more. So Pranoti, I see your question there about internships at employers. We did see employers, yes, we did see employers hiring interns over the pandemic, and that occurred mostly during the spring and summer months is when that is happening. So that was a question that we were asking employers, but we weren't necessarily asking students and graduates about their internships. We do ask about if people are employed and then what they're employed as. We did see some students getting employed over the summer and then returning to school, so those presumably were either part-time jobs or internship type jobs over the summer. I hope that answers your question.
My question had to do with the employers that were looking for internships. Were they in any? Are you doing any geographic sort of understanding of in your study?
We are collecting geographic information, yeah, so that we can start to do splits on that and some of the final data. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great.
I haven't analyzed that yet. We've been basically churning out the latest results as fast as we can while cleaning and importing data. So it's been quite a hectic few years of data collection and data analysis and currents writing for sure.
Absolutely. I did have one more question, and that had to do with sort of a longitudinal study. So are there a handful of departments that have been in this study with you all the way from the beginning, and are there some case studies that you could sort of use to tell their story over the entire pandemic?
So the answer is yes. We do have departments that have opted into the study since the beginning. Case studies, yes, but no, because participation in the study, we preserve the privacy of everybody participating. So we would have to get permission to do something like that.
So any last questions from the audience? If not, then I want to thank everyone for attending, and thank you again, Leela, for sharing with us all the latest information on the COVID-19 study, and we certainly look forward to the next full reports on that.
Great, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Leela. This was great. Again, for those of you who are attending, you will get a recording of today's webinar, so please feel free to share it with your colleagues. And if you have any questions about the AGU, AGI Heads and Chairs webinar series, or about the programs that both AGU and AGI are involved in, please do feel free to contact us. And if you're interested in the Heads and Chairs community, certainly contact me through my email address here. And if we could just go to one last slide. We have another webinar next month. So we were talking about recruiting students and how the numbers sort of have been on the decline. So if you're interested in this topic, please feel free to join us next month when we talk about how the kinds of things we should be doing to recruit students from historically place and whether using field work on the great outdoors is a good idea or not. So stay tuned and please join us. If you've missed any other previous webinars, you can find the recordings at the webinars page on the AGI website. So thank you everyone and have a great weekend.